Thank you for being with us today, Dr. McBee.
My pleasure.
Spring has truly sprung here in Athens, and I know that for you as a leader on this campus for 25 years that it brings back memories. But let's start in the beginning, the very beginning, and that would be Strawberry Plains, Tennessee. Will you share with us a little bit about your family and your growing up time then?
Strawberry Plains is the only one named that has a post office with that name in the country. It was named during the Civil War because of a lot of fighting that went on there, and wild strawberries. It's a little tiny community just out of Knoxville. I was born there. My mother was a teacher, elementary teacher in the nearby community, and met my dad, who was born in Strawberry Plains. They had 3 children. I have 2 brothers. The 3 of us were born in a 4-year period, so we grew up together. Traditional family values, church every Sunday, valued education. We're taught to respect our elders, say yes ma'am and yes sir. We started carrying the paper when I was in the 2nd grade. My little brother was in the 1st grade and my older brother was in the next grade. And we carried them for 9 years. And when you carry papers in the country, it's not like having a block where you have the houses all together. So we had long distances between our houses, but we did that for 9 years. And in a way that started me on the best lesson I had in terms of how to handle money. We had to save enough, collect enough in 1 week to pay the papers for the next week. And whatever money was left, we had to, our parents made us keep a kitty, so there was always people who didn't pay. And then we got to divide the rest of it at the end of the week and go have a big orange, as we called it. But we learned about the people who would pay for it, who would pay up every week, and the ones that we had to chase down to get the money. We knew how to take care of the money we had. And those were during Depression days, so I value those 9 years a lot. My dad worked for American Zinc Company, and as I said, my mother stopped teaching when she got married. There were 300 students in the school, 15 in my graduating class. I was the only one who went on to college. It was, as I said, a rural area where people just weren't going to college at that period. And my brother, in my senior year in high school, my senior year in high school was the year the war broke out, World War II. My brothers both volunteered. One went to the Navy and one in the Army. And then when I went off to college the next year, well, that's the next question, I suppose, though. Is that enough about Strawberry Plains?
That is. The only thing I would reference would be, tell us a little bit about McBee's Ferry. Was there a ferry?
Well, it has historical significance because it was a place built even before the Civil War where you could cross the river. My ancestors, there were 4 or 5 of my brothers in our family that came and settled along that river and set up farms, and I came out of one of those families. And that it's still marked, the McBee Ferry, by one of those state markers, federal markers, whichever, when you drive through that area.
Okay, great. Well, talk to us a little bit. You did go on and you went to East Tennessee State.
East Tennessee State.
Johnson City.
There were it was an all-female school at that time because guys were all off at war except the 4 Fs and the preachers. We had a few of those. But so it made the college experience different than it would have been if it had been not been during the war. But we got a good education, and it was small enough, the college was small enough, it was made a university that year that I graduated. It was changed from college to university. But it was small enough that the teachers, you knew all your teachers well, the classes were small. So it was a special kind of college education that a lot of kids don't get today.
Now you were a physical education major.
Well, that, and I also majored in English, and I got a teaching certificate for elementary school and high school. So you got the whole works.
Right. And it was your dream to teach.
Pardon?
It was your dream to teach.
Right, exactly. I can tell you now, I can name every one of my teachers, starting with the first grade all the way through the 12th grade. I loved my teachers. We had 2 teachers that lived in our home when I was little, who were teachers at the school. One of them, and then one later, a male who was the principal lived there. So we were always associated with teachers, and I never thought of really doing anything else at that point. And after I graduated, 4 of us went to the same town up in Virginia and got a job and taught in the same school. And I stayed there 1 year, and then I came back to East Tennessee State to head the intramural program, sports intramural program.
And at what point did you decide you wanted to work with college-age folks? I know you went on to Columbia.
Well, when I was in college, the person I admired the most was the Dean of Women, a position that at that time was, in some ways, the most important position that women ever held. They reported, most of them, to the president. They were also faculty members. And the teacher I had was the Dean of Women was taught English and also lived in one of the residence halls. I admired her greatly, and she was a principal person in my life and in my choice of going on to train in student personnel administration and eventually go back to that institution as Dean of Women.
You went to Columbia University.
Went to Columbia
in New
University.
York City. Quite a change from
Quite
Tennessee.
a change. I picked up a train in Strawberry Plains, got on with my trunk, and went to New York.
That in itself would have been an education.
That's an
to
experience.
Be in New York City.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I went on the train when I went to East Tennessee State when I started up there. The train stopped in Strawberry Plains, and I got on with my trunk, and up I went. So you don't do that anymore.
You certainly had a wonderful institution to attend, but just the mere fact of being in New York City, that was an education also?
Well, it was. And I was scared, but you know, you get up there and you go. I had a room in a dorm where there were all graduate women, and it was a wonderful experience living in New York. Every week, I cashed a check for $25, and I ate on that, and what was left at the end of the week, we went to an opera or a movie or some special thing in New York City. Went to one of the ones I ran around with had a car. She was getting a master's degree in nursing. She had a car, and we traveled around all over New York. I drove all over New York just like it was Athens. So it was a great experience, and it gave us a car to go other places. We traveled up in the east some as well. So it was a nice year.
So, and then at what point did you have your Fulbright in Holland? You taught in a school there? That
was while I was at East Tennessee State. Okay. I went back there after I got my master's and was assistant dean of women and then dean of women. And I went to Holland and taught for a year in a girls' school in Rotterdam. Wonderful experience. I went back, 3 summers ago to a gathering that they had at the school of those kids. Some of them were teachers. I knew a lot of them. I remembered them. I lived with a Dutch family, and it was a wonderful experience to be over there for a year. I had a car and traveled all over Europe.
That was your first trip abroad?
Yeah.
You got bitten by the bug then?
I got bitten by the bug then.
And then, so you returned to East Tennessee State, and at some point decided you needed to get that doctorate at Ohio State.
I left and went to Ohio State, and worked in a residence hall. The first one that had, I guess over the country, had been made co-ed. They thought I'd had experience, and so they put me in that dorm. As it turned out, there was a cinder block wall between the men and the women, so all they did was eat together, so that was a nice experience.
At what point, now I know in January of 1963 you came to Athens to interview for the Dean of Women's job. What was your driving thought on that, and what was your experience like?
Dr. Sorrells was the Dean of Students then. He wrote me and asked me to come to Athens, and I wrote him back and told him that I was not interested. I had a good job there, and that well, he said, can I come up and see you? And so he came up and to see me, and he had talked me into coming to Athens for a visit. And I stayed at the Georgia Center, which was a new facility then, and met with all the staff. And then he tried to convince me it would be the thing to do. Well, I went back and talked to my Dean of Women, the person who had been my Dean of Women. She said, you need to do that. It's a bigger school, you need to do it. And so I accepted the position and cried all the way down here. But after I got here, loved it, and it was the thing to do. It was definitely the thing to do.
So you came in though you had met some of us, right?
I had met a lot of them that you would know, Miss Artow, Miss Bonder, and Mrs. Singleton.
And of course Dean Tate.
And Dean Tate, who became my weekend pal the rest of the time I was here.
Well, I was going to ask you that question. What was a job description for a Dean of Women in 1963?
Well, of course, that was while the campus was still in loco parentis. The law had not passed that made students at that age accountable to themselves or to their parents. We stood in the place of the parents. And so the job was to keep them in line. They had to sign out when they left for the weekend. When they sign out, they had to sign out to go out at night. We controlled their dress, their behavior. It was a total kind of parental control. And it began during that period in the 60s. Well, the 60s and the 70s, in my opinion, were two decades that changed the face of American campuses. And the concept of in loco parentis, the death of it, was one of the major ones. Because I remember when I wrote parents a letter, simply because I felt it was a responsibility to do so, in 1967, saying to them that no longer is the campus standing and is the university standing in the place of the parent. Your children, you and your children will determine what they do and do not do. They will not be signing out for the weekend. So, well, of course, we had an outcry from some of the parents when that happened. But it was a change. Every relationship between the university and student was tested in that period between the 60s and the 70s. It was a period when we had the civil rights movement, and of course a lot of that started on campuses where students sat in at lunch counters and so on. And then the Vietnam War, the free speech movement, Title IX, which brought federal legislation that had to do with athletics for women. So in my opinion, there will be no 2 decades in, at least to this point, in higher education that have been, where there have been more changes between the relationship of the institution to the student.
The world did turn upside down.
It turned upside down.
We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to ask you about when Governor Carl Sanders, during the mid-60s, appointed you to the Commission on the Status of Women. It was obvious. I think that underscored the fact that women's issues were beginning to rise to the attention of certainly the state's political structure. Could you tell us a little bit about that group and how? And was that a first opportunity for you then to connect with some of the folks?
Well, it was to connect publicly and statewide. there was controversy when women were beginning to step out. It was, you know, Betty Friedan had written her book on the that really was a kickoff for the women's revolution, and that was at the same time that things were changing for students and everybody. Everything in society was in a kind of turmoil, and he set up this commission, which was done in states across the country, and we met. There were some outstanding women in the state, many of them from higher education, but also from business and industry, and it was a way to say to the state, and I thought it was a good thing for the governor to do, and subsequent governors did it as well. Appointed those commissions up until, you know, not after the 80s. It was not needed, but they worked along with husbands and newspapers and society in general in helping bring about the acceptance of women in a new role. Betty Friedan, as I said, had kicked it off, and they helped, I think, and it was a time when there were a lot of speeches made about women's role. And there was, of course, the bra-burning aspect of it, the radicals that hurt the movement in many ways rather than help it, but that was a part of it as well. And some of those took place on the campuses.
You were doing great. We had burned some bras, but I think we're through with that.
We even had a national conference on this campus, and I ended up getting a book out of it about women's changing role, and it was not met with, of course, with total acceptance, and I continued all the time I was at the university to fight for women. When I came here in 1963, there were 2 women on the administrative council, the Dean of Women and the Dean of Home Economics. And when I left in 1988, there were still 2. And I remember on the last day I was there, in fun, I took an administrative chart and I colored it pink and blue and passed it out. The next vice president came in, you remember, was Virginia Trotter after that. And women began to take increasingly roles of dean. But we're not there yet. Women still make 75 cents for every dollar that the men make. I think young women now see fewer inhibitions and barriers and are willing to tackle anything, as you know, in law, vet medicine, ag, and pharmacy. Half of the students are women, sometimes more than half. So I see that they see now that they can go into any field, but there's still a few barriers that they have to overcome. But I expect this 10-year period, this decade, will probably see the end of that. We'll have I think the next breakthrough is in politics. At this point, in Georgia, they're 21%. There were a little fewer this year than the previous years. About 40 women out of the 256, which is not very many. But we're now hearing about women, about the possibility of a woman president. And it's interesting when we see ourselves as a nation that's ahead of in everything, that we're one of the few countries in the world that have not had a woman president. Started with Golda Meir in Israel, and there were 3 this last 2 or 3 months in Chile and Israel, Chile and Germany, and some countries in Liberia, I believe it was, in Africa, where they had women presidents. Well, we ought to get to that pretty soon.
And maybe a woman governor.
And a woman governor, absolutely. So politics is going to be, I believe, their new frontier.
Next.
And when that happens, we will see an added interest in education, an added interest in agencies that deal with the poor, with the handicapped, because women have those interests, though that's the kind of legislation they sponsor. Things that have to do with the welfare of people. Men are more interested in businesses, agriculture, industry, so on. So they bring a different dimension to the political arena.
Yes, ma'am. Let's change up a minute and talk about 1968, when you left UGA for a little while and went, I believe, and served as a faculty member and Dean of Women on the Chapman College floating campus.
Right. That's right. It was a wonderful experience. Wonderful experience.
Didn't get away from students.
We had about 500 students. I taught a class. I taught a class in psychology. We started in New York and ended up at California, went all the way around the world, stopped in 3 places in Africa, India. It was a wonderful experience. Before we came to each port, we flew a professor in from a university in that port we were coming to, from one of the universities, and they would lecture. Students took classes that had to do with different religions of the world, oceanography, and things that had to do with what we were experiencing. So that school is still going on. It's with the University of Pittsburgh, I believe now, but it was a wonderful experience. And you see the world in a different way, because when we came into port, we would take them on buses and do what we called a city tour to show them where things were. When we get to, like when we were in India, if you wanted to pay extra and fly to New Delhi, you could do that. And so it was a wonderful experience.
For you and for students?
Yeah, absolutely.
That was 1968, and then we came to the end of the 60s. And there was great unrest.
Right.
And the war continued to be a catalyst in that, but also, as you mentioned, the in loco parentis philosophy. Talk to us a little bit about what you remember as challenges for the leadership at the time, because truly you were caught between, and you mentioned 1967, the letters to parents, but
yeah.
But by 68, we were having sit-ins.
Yeah, we had a sit-in about the regulations right after I came back off of the World Campus Float. The women got a little casket and put the Georgia Bell, that was the rule book, in that casket, and marched around the campus with it on their shoulders. And it may have been that weekend, it was a subsequent weekend, maybe, I'm not sure, where they took over the academic building for about 2 or 3 days. Dean Tate and I stayed there the whole time. There were men and women students and some of the faculty. It was never unpleasant. We ate peanut butter sandwiches with them and so on, but they wanted the rules gone, and that in effect brought it about, because shortly after that the rules were changed and letters went to the parents. But but we were not the last to set the rules aside. We were certainly not the first, but neither were we the last. I know Auburn, for example, kept the regulations, and some parents sent their daughters there rather than to the University of Georgia, because we did stop the regulations. And they were not just for women. Men couldn't go with their shirt tails out. I remember Dean Tate chasing them around. I mean, that seems so. Even the teachers go with their shirt tails out now. But there was a dress code that the guys had to abide by as well. Do you remember that?
I remember wearing a raincoat over my gym suit.
Yeah, and over your gym shorts, yeah.
I also remember thinking, I just cannot stay out as late as we can stay out. Now I got to go home.
Yeah.
So.
It was some of the rules were not bad, all bad. Even now, or even then, a woman student had to come home, had to come back to the dorm. Now they don't have any excuse. And I've had them tell me that.
Me too.
And so, but we probably kept some of the more unnecessary ones longer than we should have, although there were some changes made all along. So it was a difficult period. It was a difficult period on all campuses. The Vietnam War came shortly after that, and that was another difficult period. 3 students were killed at Kent State, and a lot of campuses closed down in honor of that, to honor the students who had given their lives. And because President Davidson didn't want to do that here, they took over academic building again, the students did. And it was a little tougher group to deal with then, for some reason. And we finally had to get the National Guard. President Davidson made the decision that it was getting too rough, and took them out of the building. But this campus was nothing compared with most campuses. There were not any major problems. There were no buildings, no fire set, nothing destroyed. No one was hurt, and so we got by better than most campuses.
Well, we were blessed to have you and Dean Tate during that time.
Well, I remember some of the parades they had when they marched on the Vietnam. Not dismissing, they marched to the president's home, and I remember Dean Tate walked with them, sat with them out there. So those things did help. Made a difference.
I want to talk about Dean Tate. I'm sure you have some stories about him that that we will all want to hear. But
yeah,
I know from 1969 to 1973 you served as Associate Dean of Student Affairs. Was that just a name change because we were no longer in the structure of Dean of Women, Dean of Men?
The national organizations changed their names from Dean. We've had a Dean of Women's organization that had been in existence since 1920. Had all the top professional women in the country in it. Well, they struggled to survive, and so a lot of those organizations changed their names, and campuses dropped the titles Dean of Men and Dean of Women and went to associate deans. And here Dean Tate was opposed to it, and in some ways I was, but anyway, those titles were changed, and some of the responsibilities were given to him and some to me. But that was a result of the change in how students were related to during that period.
During that time period, from 69 to 73, and you mentioned, I think, Title IX earlier. The Title IX legislation was passed, and I think people look at it with an emphasis on the athletic part, but it was across the board. Was not any activity that students...
Right. You could not spend more money on and have more teams, for example, more men's teams than you could have women's teams. The only thing we had then was, that I recall, was basketball. To any great extent that did a lot of traveling, and then the women's basketball. I remember when Liz Murphy was made a director of that, they had to sell cookies and drive their own cars and so on. And Title IX changed all of that, and there was a great amount of unrest about that. People didn't want that change. They thought that girls didn't need to play those kinds of sports at that level, that it was interfering with things that people enjoyed for the men. I was the chair of the Title IX committee on the campus, and we had students and faculty on it and put it in line with the federal regulations. But it took a while to implement it, although it was passed in 72, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
It took several years, and as late as year before last, we put in the, what do you call it, when you ride the horses? The equestrian program was put in for women so that we'd have a balance with the number of men's organizations and the women's organizations. Is it the same now? No, probably not. But it's a lot better than it was. And if you want to find out the interest in women's activities, you go to gymnastics.
Second most.
It's the highest, attendance
except
football. And if you look at the record of the women's sports, you see there are more awards that have been won by the women than by the men.
Going on right this weekend.
Going on this weekend with
with
women's our basketball team and of course our swimming team.
Right.
Well, and our women's basketball team has gone to the Final Four several times, and go to the NCAA tournament just about every year. And the men have been once. So the women are doing very well.
Yes, they are. They are that. In 1973, you were named Dean of Student Affairs, which was the top position in that area. And
it was a time when a lot of heads were falling in student affairs. Just, I suppose, partly because of the great number of students. When I came here, there were 11,000. By that time, they were in their 20s. Now we're in the 30s. And campuses all over the country are growing. And the adjustments with student life cost a lot of people positions. And that happened here. And then I went into student affairs. Then we had the streakers and the whole business of the sit-in and the over not allowing a dance for the gay dance on a Friday night that they took out a court order against us, and they were allowed to have it. The judge gave them do you remember that?
I don't remember that one.
The gays were just beginning to make a racket on campuses, and they wanted to have a dance at Memorial. We still had Memorial Hall then, where that was the only student center. And we turned it down that they could have it, and they took us to court. And so they got issued an order against us and had it. And I remember I took all of the staff and we went to the hall where they had it to try to see that there were no problems. And a lot of the people who came to it were from Atlanta, but it was quite an event and made a lot of press in the state. And then the streaking, we won the NCAA championship in that. And so after those two, I decided if I had a chance, that I believe I'd get into something else.
And you did.
And I did. Shortly after that,
Right.
I was offered a position in academic affairs. It's not easy to move out of student affairs into academic affairs, but I had an opportunity, so I did, and I was pleased. It was a new direction.
And your responsibilities obviously did change then. What were the focus?
Well, I started in working with faculty and with new courses and with curriculum, and which was a thing I was interested in and I enjoyed, and so I had about the same number of years in that as I did in student affairs, and so it was. And not many people have that opportunity to switch out of student affairs into academic affairs, so I was really pleased and really blessed to be able to do that.
And you moved up while you were in that position.
Right.
In that area. Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs. And then in 1986, we had the Jan Kemp affair.
Right.
Will you talk a little bit about that? Tell us.
Well, it was a nationwide exposure to problems that were not just on this campus, but were on every campus, where students who were athletes, male athletes, were given special exceptions on admission. And efforts were made in the case of the University of Georgia. We had what we called developmental studies. And the director of that would work for 2 years with students to try to bring who have come in as athletes, and other students as well, but primarily the athletes were the problem, where even after 2 years they were not able to do college level work. And so it was her thinking that it was not fair to the institution or the student to bring someone in who could not make the grade. And she kept saying that, and I think rightly so. And we probably didn't listen as well as we should have. Anyway, the event that brought it all to head was that the head of developmental studies, who was Leroy
Irvin.
Yeah, Irwin, wanted to dismiss her. It was over a Christmas holiday, and Dr. Trotter was already gone, and I was here. And he came to me, and I said, not on my watch. I said, I don't think that ought to be done till we have some discussion on it. But anyway, he did it, and she sued the university. And as I said, it gave national exposure to a problem that was not just ours. And believe me, in our cleaning up our shop, other institutions did the same. The president, in President Davison's defense, he had already set up a national organization called Collegiate something that had to do with trying to raise the standards for athletes. And he was heading that up, and with an effort to get colleges. The problem was that if other students played athletes who were not as qualified, then if you're going to win, you had to play them too. So everybody was doing it. We were not the only ones. And so he was trying to correct the thing nationally, to his credit. But this all broke before he got it done. And so it ended up, of course, in the president being removed from his position, the vice president, and the director of developmental studies. And was a sad and tragic time in the life of the university, but we came out all the stronger as a result of it. Cleaned our shop up, and then other institutions over the country did the same. I think in my opinion, the NCAA, which controls college athletics, should have stepped up before it ever came to a head, because I can't believe they didn't know it was going on pretty much over the country with any institution that was major in football, not the University of Chicago, not Harvard and those schools, but schools where football was big, our athletics was big. It was going on. So then Dr. Stanford was brought in as an acting president, and he was the one for the job, because he went from one side of this state up and down making speeches that everything is okay at the university, we're going to be fine, keep supporting it, keep sending your students here, keep contributing to the funds and so on. And he did. He healed us that year in a real way. He did in 1 year, just by he had been president of 4 or 5 universities, was an articulate spokesman for a higher education, and so he went around the state preaching the gospel for the university.
I've heard you call him a healer.
Yeah. And
I know he placed a call to you at one point, and tell us about that. Where were you and what happened?
I was with my cousin and a friend of hers. We're getting ready to go down the Colorado River on a raft, and I was down in the bottom we'd walked down the Bright Angel Trail to get down to the bottom of the canyon where we picked up the boat. And they said I had an emergency call, and so I got to it, and it was Dr. Stanford wanting to know if I would accept that job. And so I did. And then I thought about it the rest of the trip, I can tell you. But we went on down the river for a week, and then I came back.
It was a very popular appointment here on campus. Faculty and students and staff knew somebody they could trust. I think with Dr. Stanford in his position for a while, and you moving into that position, things stabilized. And
well, they did. People wanted to get well, and so we had some meetings with Coach Dooley, and pointed out that it had been a very bad time for the university, and that the president had lost a job and the vice president in the developmental studies, and that it was in his shop and that we just had to get some things changed. And so we did.
It came about. You served in that position until you retired as the second highest administrator, behind only the president, on this campus in 1988. And what a great retirement event.
Yeah, had us an ice cream party.
A great ice cream
Yeah.
social on North Campus on a wonderful summer day with hundreds of your colleagues and friends there to say thank you for all you did.
Yeah, it was a really fun time.
It was a great one. Talk a little bit about what you see as your biggest challenges during your 25 years at the university. And then we'll ask you about the high points. We'll give you the good part, save the dessert.
Yeah. Well, I think the hardest time was in student affairs when you wanted, when you were standing in the place of their parents, when you wanted them to do well, you didn't want them to get into any kind of trouble. And yet, because of the rules, it kind of set up a barrier between you and the student. And so the people that you were supposed to be their best advocate, their friend, saw you less than that. Now, the students you got to know, the student leaders, ones who got in trouble and you got to know them personally, they changed their opinion. I sat by a man, I'm on a board that I sat by a gentleman, and we talked the whole day. I knew his name, but that didn't mean a thing. And we chatted all day long. At the end of the day, this has been in the last year, he said, "You don't know me, do you?" And I said, "Well, know your name." He said, "You sent my wife and me home. You indeed Tate," he said, "you indeed Tate sent my wife and me home when we were in school here." I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, we took off without signing out, and without her signing out, and went to Florida for the weekend without anybody knowing about it. And you found out somehow, I guess, when they got back." And he said, "I just want to tell you that you turned our life around." He said, "I'm married to her now." And he said, "We had been messing around way too much. We weren't studying. Said we probably would have flunked out." And he said, "That turned us around." He said, "You let us come back the next quarter." Well, and I've heard those kinds of stories from other students, maybe just not that dramatic, but where they were called in for something they had done and so on, and tell you that it straightened them out. And so those are positive things. But then you also see the students that you somehow had, they saw you as a role model, or somebody that, a woman in a high position that they recognized and at least at a distance admired. And that as they grew older, they were influenced by it. And some of them have told me that I made a difference in their life, and I'm sure there are others who just don't bother to say it. So if there's anything that I would like to think I have done, that would be it, that I have influenced students for the good.
Absolutely. And that would be a high point.
Right.
Is there an event that you can think of as a high point in your 25 years here, something that made you know, and it may be the kind of thing of somebody coming and sitting down and saying, "You changed my life"?
Well, and I've gone to battle for some students who are going to be in real trouble, and have gone as their advocate. One of them is a vice president of a big company right now. I won't call his name, but he was in real trouble, and I went to bat for him because he came to see me, and I thought he was right. And so I stood up for him, and he got to graduate. And as I said, he's a vice president now of a big company in New York, and sent me a big check when I started to run for the legislature. But I sent it back to him because he was with a tobacco company. I told him I couldn't take it because I was going to fight smoking in public.
And that's why people remember you. You served under 4 presidents?
5. I still consider serving. I do so much for the university now. I feel like I'm serving under Dr. Adams too.
And you
So I'm counting him.
You've served on the Arch Foundation board, or
right.
something. And you've served along countless outstanding faculty and staff, and known innumerable students. Talk to us about some of the interesting personalities that you've known, and certainly I think Dean William Tate would be somebody you'd have to.
Oh yeah, and Dr. Stanford, and all the, you know, I've worked for 4 presidents on the job, and all of them were great people. Earl Leonard, who was vice president for Coca-Cola. Tom Cousins, who was chair of the foundation, University Foundation. I guess that was the title they had it then. And when this whole thing with Dr. Davison and the Kemp affair, what he did to bring us through that. We had a big thing for Dr. Davison and gave him a car, had it in the gymnasium that's full of people from all over the state. He did that and helped begin the healing after that. Then Pierre Howard, who was a vice president, a big tennis player here. Buddy Darden, who was a U.S. Congressman. The past president of the Board of Regents was a student here that I worked closely with. He was a member of the, headed up the Senate, I think. Let's see, who else? Of course, Dean Rusk. The opportunity to know a man of that stature and meet him on the campus every morning as I walked into the office. Dr. Adderholt was a real giant. One of the early presidents of Southern institutions, and kind of began to, particularly in agriculture, made agricultural a science at this institution. It's still the biggest industry in the state. People don't think about that being the case, and we don't hear as much about it, agriculture now. But he was the one that built the agricultural scholarship at this institution in his tenure here. So, and then there are lots of students now that are in the legislature that are going to move right on up. I can see it already. Who were
the rising hope of our land.
Yeah, the rising hope of our land. Our next lieutenant governor, well, our 25 governors, I guess maybe 26 counting, son, Governor Perdue, who was a veterinary graduate. I believe he's the 25th governor who are graduates to the university, which is something. And we've got, let's see, I believe, Taylor and Cox are both graduates of the university. So we're going to have if we're lucky, we're going to have another graduate. I'll not get into politics.
Talk to me a little bit. I've worked with Dean Tate off and on and early in my professional career, and one of the stories that he told me repeatedly was that he wanted to die in a body house in a fight with a man over a woman.
Now, I never heard that.
I just, you know, what an institution here, what an icon, and I know you have some stories, and maybe some you cannot tell.
Well, we used to laugh. We talked about spending the weekend together, which we did, because chasing beer trucks from Arcade or raiding men's apartments to get the women. But he was, he had a way with students, even though he was, they were scared to death of him. They respected him. He knew their daddies and their granddaddies, and if a student was about to get in trouble, he would ask them their name. They would scare him to death because and they'd say, then when he told him, he would say, oh yeah, and then tell him their daddy's name and so on. Well, they thought that they would get it when they got home. So he was a disciplinarian in a way without having to draw too much on any of the laws. He could just walk around the campus and behavior would change.
In his ball cap.
And his ball cap.
Lined up, when we were lined up to register, in lines out of Stegman Hall and out of the Coliseum. You know, it is amazing the things that you remember from your time and the things that made it, you know, you get sentimental about now. So.
He turned in a report one Monday morning to me. We always had to discuss what had happened over the weekend. That he had to carry, and he named a student, a woman student, into the dorm. Well, I took it in that she was drinking or something, that he actually carried her physically. And I called her in that afternoon. She said, I didn't, she said he walked in with me, but he didn't carry me. That he used the expression when he was with someone as carrying him. And I could tell some more, but I'd better not on where different words had different meanings.
Well, back to a great retirement event, wonderful event on North Campus, and then that was a big year because you had a Mountaintop Experience in 1988. Talk about the Georgian expedition to Mount Everest.
Well, a student, I had hired a student to help me put down sod in my yard, and it turned out that it was the guy who was wanting to go to Mount Everest, son of a faculty member here. And he said, asked if I would help him get permission for them to go. You had to get permission through they wanted to go to the east face of Everest, so you had to get permission from the Chinese government. So we had a number of Chinese students, so I wrote the embassy in Texas. It was in Texas for some reason. And they gave us immediate permission to go. And he said, if you get us permission, we'll take you with us. And kind of in jest, I thought. But we tried then to set up a committee. We did set up a committee to try to raise money. And I remember I called Pepsi-Cola. We had a student who was a high officer in Pepsi-Cola at that point to try to see if they would give us money. But her comment was that businesses didn't like to see pictures of their sign with dead bodies, you know, because 1 out of 7 on Everest doesn't make it. 1 out of every 7 who attempted. But the reason the university was interested in it, there were some faculty who wanted to go to study high altitude in terms of what it does to your body, your physical abilities under that kind of stress, and then why people make bad decisions when they're high up on and high altitudes. And so there was a great interest among us several faculty in doing that, but we couldn't raise the money. And so they got a lot of the food and tents and equipment that were given to us. But anybody else who went, you had to pay your way. Now it costs about $70,000 to go with a group that are going through Nepal to Everest. I don't know what it would cost on the east face, but it cost us, as I remember, we put up $6,000 each, Dr. Stanford and I, and the other people. Alec Patterson was a graduate of this institution. He was in the group.
On the foundation board too, I think.
Right. And there were
scholar. Alex Patterson was a Rhodes Scholar, I believe.
Right, right. And there may have been then there were, I think, 1 or 2 other graduates that but I don't remember. But anyway, with that group together, we got it all put together and we went. Dr. Stanford and I, when we got to China, got to Beijing, we went to the American Embassy and asked if there was any rescue on Everest, because through Nepal there is. They could take helicopters and go pick up people. But they said, you're on your own, which was a great feeling of satisfaction. But anyway, we were at that point, so we had to go on. So we traveled 300 miles. No, first we had to get from Beijing down to Chengdu and then over to Lhasa, Tibet. So we crossed China on a train, which was quite an experience. We went first class, but people were getting on with their chickens and all. And we took peanut butter and crackers mostly and ate like that. But we were on the train 2 nights, I think it is, I remember, to get down to Chengdu. And then we flew from there to Lhasa in Tibet and stayed there about a week while we adjusted. It was 12,000 feet we went from 2,000 to 12,000 when we got to Lhasa. And we stayed there about a week to adjust to the altitude, and then we took 3 vans, or they were kind of really old cars, and loaded us up in them and drove 300 miles over places where there were just no roads across Tibet to get to the roadhead where we would start hiking. And then 7 of our group had gone on ahead, the ones that were going to try to make it to the top. And we rested one day at the roadhead and then hiked. I can't remember how many days it took us now, but we'd hike about 5 or 6 miles a day. Dr. Stanford and I were able to do it. It was easier for me than it was for him later on in the hike, because he started getting congested, and if you get too much you have to come down. And so they helped him. They carried his backpack and helped him some. But we were not, none of us used oxygen, and you just take one step and have to stop and get a breath. And so we got along just as well as the rest of them, and they were kind and good to us. But it was a wonderful experience, and no, we had no casualties. The guys who tried to make it to the top did not make it because they lost some of their altitude. It was a warmer summer than usual, and the ropes got, there was an avalanche that tore the ropes down, and they had lost some of their food, and they made the decision to come down. And at the same time they were there was a group from Germany and a group from Japan, and they both lost climbers. So,
well, what a lifetime experience.
Right.
One of those mountaintop experiences, and what an affirming.
Right.
That pick it up and go.
Right. I visualized sitting by a stream with a campfire. Well, when you land, you're already above the tree line. So there was the only fire we had was a little Bunsen burner and 2 little pots that we cooked there. That's what we cooked on. But
we're glad you made it home.
I made it home.
Dr. McBee, talk to us a little bit about some of the women that made a difference on this campus that you worked with as you were.
Yeah. Well, and it was a tougher time. When I came here, the women students had to have a higher average to get in than the men. That was 63. And I remember going to the committee. I wish I could remember the man that headed that committee. He was in the College of Education. It was a faculty committee. And I went to him and I said, why is it that the women students have to have a higher average to get in than the men? And he said, well, it'd be overrun with women. I said, well, if they make that. He said, well, they get. I said, that's not fair. That's not fair. And he said, well, women make higher grades in high school than boys. I said, why? Why do they? Well, he said, because they're neat and they behave. And said we just have to take that into consideration. I never got that changed, and I tried to work with women on the campus faculty, but I never got that changed until the law changed it. But we had some strong women on this campus, and among the strongest were some of the ones in the Dean of Women's office. Dolores Artau, if you wanted to tangle with, she took care of the international students, and was really known the country over at that time for her work with international students. And we had a good number of them when you consider how early that was for international travel. And she took good care of them, saw that the faculty worked with them, and so on. Then Bertie Bondurant, who was from one of the families of Athens, her nephew is now a big lawyer in Atlanta. Her brother was owner of a lumber company. One of her relatives discovered ammonia. Was it ammonia? Anesthetic. Anyway, she came from a wonderful old family here in Athens, Bertie Bondurant. And then Margaret Singleton, who was on the faculty. Nell Schultz. I brought her. She was Dean of Women at Bernal, and I brought her to this campus and built women's studies around her. We developed the program. Then it's still going on the campus as it is on campus. There was a black studies and women's studies, two things that grew out of movements, the women's movement and the black movement. And they still are programs that are on campuses across the country and that you can still get a major in. I think you can, or a minor at least, on this campus in either women's studies or black studies. But she headed up built that program from the beginning. Then there were some in the College of Education, like Catherine Blake, who was her research on the mentally retarded and the handicapped student was known all over the country. There were people in home economics. Well, the few fields that women particularly were majoring in education and home economics. Right. Very few in the science and agriculture like there are now, or farm. It was unusual to see them in pharmacy at that point, or in vet medicine, or law, even law. That in some ways became a first breakthrough for women on this campus. They started coming into the law school. Now it's about half of the women. So considering that women were in the beginning of the university kept on a campus out where the Navy School is now, a separate campus. They didn't even get to be on the campus until the 40s, I think it was. That they've done right well.
One other name that we mentioned briefly was Liz Murphy, who came in.
Yeah. There ought to be a building or something on this campus named for Liz Murphy, because she came in at a very difficult time before there was any money or really any support behind women's athletics. They just kind of put it in as and brought her in to head it up. And as I said a little bit earlier, they sold cookies and did everything they could to get use their own vehicles to start the programs. But before it was all over, Title IX had passed, and things were a different picture because of national law. And I went to her funeral in North Georgia, along with a month ago or so, 2 months ago, and all of the coaches were there, and most, with one exception, she had hired them. We've had one of the most successful programs in women's athletics in the country, and it was on the back of Liz Murphy. I'm a great admirer of her at the time, because she did it without kicking up any fuss. She just did it by friendly persuasion and by showing that people did care about those sports, would come to them, that she knew how to recruit good coaches. And if you want to know about Liz Murphy, you ask one of the coaches she hired, they'll fight for her. And we're at her funeral in support.
She will be missed.
She will be missed, or she is missed. And they have not replaced that position in terms of title. Have you noticed that?
And you ran for the legislature, the Georgia House of Representatives, in June, and were elected in June of 1991. It was a three-way race, as I recall. You won without a runoff.
Right.
And then ran unopposed for the next 5 terms as a state representative for the Athens-Clarke County House District. And while you were there, you served as chair of the Higher Education Committee. You were on the Appropriations Committee, vice chair of the Retirement Committee, vice chair of World Congress Center Overview Committee, and involved in the Women's Legislative Caucus. When did you have time to eat?
Well, it was a really wonderful experience. I really enjoyed it. I had worked after I left the university. We had just voted in to put Athens and Clarke County together, and I was on a 3 or 4 member team that worked on that. And somebody, several asked me, why didn't I run for? They called it CEO then instead of mayor, but I just didn't want to do that. And then Lawton Stevens was made a judge. I knew he was in the running, but he was a brand new lawyer, and I didn't think he would get it. But his sister called me that afternoon about something else, and she said, "Oh, by the way, Lawton just made Superior Court judge." I turned right around and went to the phone and called the paper and the paper, and told him that I was going to run for his seat. And so the next morning, his picture was on one side in the paper that he'd been made judge, and mine was on the other side that I was running for his seat. And people wondered how I found out about it. It was just, Mary, his sister, had called me because she had worked for me, and called me about something and told me. So that was exciting.
What would you say were in your heart, what do you feel your greatest accomplishments were during that?
In the legislature? Well, one thing, the teachers in this state had never had credit for unused sick leave, which means a day a month for all the time you work. And so I that was one of the first things I began to work on. It was very expensive to do, but I finally got it done. And now people get credit for unused sick leave, which makes, if you haven't had a major illness and missed a lot of work, $200 or $300 difference a month in your retirement pay.
And we're glad you did. All of us in this room.
Then it was not retroactive, I must say. I was out 4 days the whole time I was at university, and so teachers were losing a lot, and it was not fair because other state employees were having it. But that was one of the bills that I was the proudest of.
Following the 2003 legislative session, you were appointed, excuse me, by House Speaker Terry Coleman as co-chair of the Hope Scholarship Study Commission. Talk to us a little bit about how Hope has changed Georgia.
It has changed Georgia. I have said it was the best thing that happened to the state in the 20th century. That's last century. And I really truly believe that. Why? Because it gave, it raised the aspiration level of students who had never thought that college was in their future. They saw that with that money they had a chance. And then it kept our brightest students in state. Those are two major things that deal with the population of the state. And that's the reason I think it was the best thing that happened to Georgia. Over 800,000 students now have gone through the university system, or the state system, with the Hope Scholarship. It's the best program in the country. And the reason why the politicians fight about it in terms of who's doing the most for it. You know, the lieutenant governor he's got what he wants to do with it, and the governor had what he wanted to do with it. And several other bills have been. It's because it is popular and everybody knows about it. You ask anybody about what the Hope Scholarship is, and they know. And so it makes it a good political asset, if you can use it, and a target for all of the politicians. It is not in any danger. The study committee that was appointed by the governor to study it the last summer I was there was made up of students, parents, and the heads of all the agencies that were involved with Hope, plus some faculty members from over the state. It was a good committee, and the report that we came out with takes care of the Hope Scholarship. There was one thing that was done that you see in the paper that people get aggravated about, was that they used the money to build a technology building at Tech, Georgia Tech. It's a beautiful building. It fit under the definition of what money could be used for with Hope, except nobody expected them to, when they said technology, to build a building. They expected them to give computers, which they did to public school kids and to college students for a while. They expected technology in that frame of reference and not in the frame of reference of a $57 million building. So it made a lot of people, including yours truly, angry when they found out it was done very quietly and not very open. But they could defend it that it was a building that is a technology building, a beautiful building on the Tech campus. So there's now a bill that was put in by that committee that says no more buildings out of the Hope money because it cuts too big a swath of the funds. They've been concerned about the amount of money diminishing, but there's only been 1 year since it started 12 years ago, 12 or 13, where it has been less than the year before. They offer new games, there are more people in the state, and so they keep playing. The thing that I think is the biggest question that may still arise with the Hope is whether or not it should be a need-based scholarship. And people will make that argument, as they did in our study committee. But then they always come back to, we're keeping our bright students in the state. And those are the ones who do have money. A lot of them come from families, moneyed families, that could send them anywhere they wanted to. So, but they keep them in Georgia and give them a car or a house or an apartment or whatever.
It certainly has changed the landscape of.
But it's changed the landscape of Georgia and will continue to change it. And there may be a time when they will think that because it's people who have need are the ones who play the lottery the most. 70% of at one point the data they had gathered, 70% of the people who play the lottery are people who make less than $25,000. So that does seem sad, but the committee that studied it decided nevertheless they would keep it for everybody, because the Hope stands for helping outstanding pupils educationally. It doesn't say anything about how rich or poor you are.
We talked about interesting personalities that you knew on campus, and I'd like to do that too. I know during your tenure here on campus and then in the legislature, I think we had 8 to 9 governors: Sanders, Maddox, Carter, Busby, Harris, Zellmiller, Roy Barnes, Sonny Perdue.
Yeah.
You mentioned several people. I know Buddy Darden, some folks who have been in the legislature and that you've known. Anybody that just jumps out at you that you?
Well, a lot of the guys that are in the legislature now and that are going to be future leaders of this state are graduates of this institution. I couldn't begin to name them all right now, but as I said earlier, the governors of the state have all come from this institution. And one of the reasons when I get excited about the Blue Key and some of those organizations, I'm going to speak to them next week, I believe it is, when they get initiated and their parents come for that. And I'm going to say someone in this room will be the next governor of Georgia, not the next, but will be a governor of Georgia, and I really believe that. They come out of that group. And Buddy Darden was in that group. Joel Wooten, who was chair of the Regents, was in that group. That's where they seem to spot those outstanding students, and they eventually measure up.
Leadership of the state out of the University
Right.
of Georgia. So. You served 6 terms in the House. You left the House in 2004, and then you came back to Athens. And if I read off the list of organizations in this community that you've been a member of, we would not leave here today. You've been on the boards of the Red Cross, the Girl Scouts, the Athens-Clarke County Chamber of Commerce, the Salvation Army, the First Methodist Church. You were on the Athens-Clarke County Hospital Authority, the Chamber of Commerce, and the list goes on and on and on. You've been honored by countless groups, certainly receiving well-deserved awards, but I think the most recent was the 2nd annual Eldridge McMillan Lifetime Achievement Award, which was presented by the University System of Georgia Foundation, honoring a lifetime of service to young people and to Georgia. What a fitting tribute.
Well, it was very nice, and I was very touched. But there were 800 people there that night, and I looked out over that crowd and I said, these are people who have supported me and worked with me, and many deserving as I am of this award. But it was a really wonderful, wonderful evening, and I was really touched by it.
You once said that we are born obligated to pour back into the stream that has nourished us, to replenish it for others. And I personally can attest that for those of us who have been nourished by your example, that you have been a wellspring of inspiration. And
well, thank you.
Thank you for being here today.
Oh, we're done. Hey, we're done.
Unless you have something else you think you'd like to.
No. I may think of something when I get home, but
it took me 3 days to go through your life. What a wonderful, wonderful life, and
oh, yeah.
just the,
Well, it ain't over yet.